All right, just a couple things as we get started, just so you're aware of this. There is a folder out there also on the P drive. You don't have to go out to it. You've got most of the stuff in there. But there's also a couple articles I put out there, one on NSUserDefaults and one on Segways, all right, that you might find worth reading. They're both about 10 or so pages long. I threw them up in a Word, all right? First program I'd like to go over here with you, and it may look real ugly, only because it is, but talks about using NSUserDefaults. And NSUserDefaults is something that you use for permanent storage, but you won't use it for permanent storage if it's small stuff. You know, you wouldn't save images, you wouldn't save huge documents and stuff in there, but if you've got something small, maybe you want to save somebody's login and password or something like that, you can do that. And it does save it in as permanent storage. It's not a database. All right. Today we're going to talk, among other things, we're going to talk about NSUserDefaults. Next week we're going to talk about core data. All right. Again, you'll see it on the sheet, but just so you know, 2 weeks from today there are no classes on the 21st. It's a teacher in service day. If I had my choice, we would have class. We wouldn't have teacher in service. All right. It's interesting. This isn't going to affect any of you in here, but for the first year people, we have, I like to consider at least, our CIO, Mary Scholler, is actually, she's a pretty cool lady. She really is. She came up to me last week and she said, she asked me to do something that I asked 5 years ago if I could do and was laughed at. And that is, she said, would your people, your first and second year people, your web people, would they be interested in working on the school's website and actually updating it, upgrading it, etc.? Because they'd already put money out there for a contract to have somebody do it, but I guess the cost, they were expecting it to be in the cost of the bid they got back. There was quite a bit of difference between them. So these people could do it, and again, many of them could do it as part of their internship. All right, but when I asked that years ago, I was told students aren't worthy. Literally, that's about what I was told. But she seems to have a different mindset, which I think is really good. All right. Okay, that said, this may look a little bit strange, but I want to talk about it. First of all, as you'd probably guess, when the program was first created, this stuff here was not, these lines 19, 20, 21, and 22, 23, and 24, I guess, around there, whatever. Those lines were not commented out. The reason that they're commented out now is because what that does is that sets those values. But with them commented out, if you run the program, boom, everything is cool. But then if you turn off those values and run the program again, now it shouldn't be setting these things. You understand what I'm saying? And it's not. What it's done is it's kept in memory, it's kept those values. All right? So when you're working with this stuff, what we're doing right here, basically in here, is we're writing this stuff out, and in here, we're reading it back. Does that make sense? And there's a couple simple pieces of data in here. Notice, Jeff Scott, for key, name. So IT instructor, for key, position, 50,000, for key, salary. So if you get the idea, these things are like dictionaries. They're like key value pairs. So in other words, Jeff Scott is the value and the key is name. IT instructor is the value and the key is position. 50,000 is the value and key is salary. Does all that make sense? Looks a little different than dictionaries because most of the time most people are used to saying the key first, then the value. That's not the way they do it here, for whatever reason. All right. And again, I think you all know this by now, but I'd like to keep saying it anyway. Anytime you see anything that starts with NS, again, that stands for next step, and that's all Objective-C stuff, basically. And it's all Objective-C stuff that you're able to use inside of Swift. All right? So again, what this says is basically I'm setting a new object, I'm creating a new, it's kind of like I'm creating a new dictionary, all right? Again, with a key value, key value, key value. So there's 3 of them that I'm creating, okay? And then here, all I'm doing is printing them back out. So literally, when we first did this, that should print out Jeff, that should print out IT instructor, that should print out 50,000. All that makes sense? All right. Now the problem that you get when you work with this stuff is, remember, like it or not like it, the thing about this language is it's so darn particular. And if you notice in here, what have we done? We've got var name, var position, etc. The same kind of stuff. All right? But it's that thing right there. That unwrapping thing. All right? And what I'm telling you, though, is with that exclamation point there, it expects a value to be there. If you don't have a value there, the program is going to crash. All right? And we've gone through enough of these. You see sometimes it's the question mark. Sometimes it's the exclamation point. Once in a while you put in 2 exclamation points in a row and it just looks really weird. The good news is most of the time when you do this, if you forget to put something in that you should have put in or put something in that you shouldn't have put in, most of the time the compiler catches it for you. All right? And it catches it for, I shouldn't even say the compiler because I associate the compiler with being at runtime. But it's more the interpreter because as you're putting it in, it'll show you the errors that you have in there. All right? So again, what we're saying in here is, all right, this has already been set. So I'm saying just print them out right here. So in other words, I want to print out the value that's in there for name, and it's a type string. The value for position, and it's type string. The value for salary, and it's type double. I could have made that an int also. It doesn't matter because there's no decimal point in it. And that's all fine and dandy, but I wanted to also show it to you in here too, because notice here, we're working with an array. And I set up an array. Again, this was originally not commented out. So we had an array here that was called family names. And it contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 values. All right. Then what I'm saying is, using NSUserDefaults, write that out. All right. And the object we're writing out is family name. And the key is array. This can be anything you want, but it usually, when you're setting up a key, you'll set it up to be something that is very much associated with what it is you're trying to do. All right? And then right here, what are we doing? Well, notice I'm basically now not writing it out, but I'm writing it to a variable right there. All right? And I say the youngest member of the Scott family is, well, I put them in order 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I run this, and I'll run it for you right now just so you can see the output. Purposely moving that over as far as I can so you can see the associated code with it. All right? And I just brought this up right now, but the point is, what I'm able to do then, after I do this, is I can totally close this down, bring it up and run it again, and it'll have those values. It's the equivalent of those being stored in memory someplace. All right? I'm not even sure exactly where with NSUserDefaults it stores it. It's someplace. The example that we're going to go through next week, I've been building it right now. It's a simple contact form, and it's going to use core data. And you're going to look at it, you're going to go, oh, it's a database. Okay? Because it looks just like a database. In fact, we're going to go in and look at some stuff, and you're going to go, it's a database. Guess what? It ain't a database. And not only that, Apple goes out of its way to tell you it's not storing it in a database. But they don't exactly tell you, really how it's being stored. But it's the equivalent of a database. Now, why nothing is printing out here? I have apps. Oh, there it is. See it down on the bottom? Because we use print line. There's me, there's the title, there's the salary, there's the youngest member of the family. Okay, go ahead.
How much space do you have? Right. All this stuff. I mean, you said don't write a lot of information, but how much?
everything that I've read basically says that it should be in Ks. You know what I'm saying? That if you start to get up to megabytes, etc., that you should use this. And the reason that you should use it, the reading isn't bad, but the writing is slow, and anytime anything is changed, it goes back and it rewrites everything. So if you've got hundreds of things in there, it goes back and writes hundreds of them. So if all you did was reset a Boolean flag, it goes back and it rewrites everything. Because it looks at it as being a unit, even if you break it up like I've done here. It still writes it, not reads it, but writes it all out as a unit. All right, I think it's the best answer I can give you.
Is that written to like non-volatile memory? I mean, have you powered down the device?
Yes. The question was, is it written to not? Yes, that's the thing about it, yes. And you're going to see this in a little bit when we do that to-do list. You're going to see that. Because literally you can turn the machine off, turn it back up again, and this stuff will be here. In fact, with a to-do list, we're going to just get out, and you know, if you write it, you don't have it. Everything we've been doing thus far, you know, you run the program, and everything's fine. You get your output, etc., but you're not saving it. There's nothing persists. So this is the simplest, crudest way of having persistent storage there is. All right. The reading is fast. The writing is very slow for the reason I just gave you. Yes.
Does this supersize to iCloud? Like if you want to store this same process?
I'm not sure, but I see no reason why it wouldn't. All right. Especially considering the size requirements. I wouldn't think there'd be any problem. You can write coordinate out to iCloud, so I don't know why you couldn't write this. So again, that's a very simple example. It's meant to be very simple, but just so you see that. All right. The next thing that's in here, these are segues. And when you see me run it, and you see it up on the screen, I did it for Mark because my two screens are green and gold. All right. There they are. Okay. I'm going to show you something about this in just a second, but I want you to understand the way that this worked. This was set up as a single view application. Everything we've been doing thus far, right? Single view, single view, single view. Then I went down here and I brought in another view controller. Literally brought in another one. Boom. That was this one right here. Okay? So by default, what happens is this thing that you see right here, this arrow means that's the view controller you start with. Okay? Then I added a button here and I added a button here. All right? Then I went and control drag from that button anywhere to a blank space on the form here, and that caused this little thing here, and then control drag from here over to here, and that caused this one. These weird things that you see in there, those are known as segues. The second article that I mentioned that's on out on the P drive with today's date on it is about 10 or 11 pages, and it's on segues. The one that they build is this one's got two buttons. Every time you click one of the buttons, it adds one to a counter. Okay, it's just a pretty simple example. When you click the other one, it sends you over to the other screen, and in there, instead of having this, it's got a label that shows you how many times you clicked the button on the first one. All right? So it's a way that you can have send information back and forth between, and these are literally referred to as scenes. All right? But different view controllers. All right, so if I run this, two things I want to show you here. The first, I want to do a run, then we'll come back and take a quick look at it. What you're going to see is, again, with these buttons, when I click either one of them, when you set up segues, there are a bunch of different ways that you can set segues up. And I just chose basically the default, all right, which is show. If you say, what does that mean? You're going to see it in just a second. You may or may not agree, but it's a fairly natural transition from one screen to the other, and hopefully you'll see when I do this why I changed the color on the two screens. All right, because if you go from white screen to white screen, the effect really isn't very dramatic. But notice that when I click here, so if I click the button, that's just show. And that's literally going from one screen to the other because I didn't put any code in there to do that, just so you know. All right? again, I want to make sure you understand this. What I did was I control dragged here from the button over to here. And when you do that, it's not going to bring anything up because I've already set the segue up. All right. If I don't want the segue anymore, I can take my mouse, highlight it, click, it's gone. That makes sense? That's how easy it is to add and remove segues. So I come back onto here. Do another control drag over to here, and there it is. It says, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a show? Do you want to do a show detail, persist, pop over, and custom? All right. And notice the other two are in here, but they're deprecated. Okay. In that article that I put out there on the system, they give a little explanation of what show is, of what detail is, of what present modality is, pop over, presentation, and custom. So if you want more on it, I just wanted to bring this up and show it to you. So again, all I do here is I click the show, and boom, it's back again. You may or may not be able to see it really well, but it added it back. Okay? This has changed, just so you know. Yeah, right now, there's a, if I click over here on the second form, okay, and I go, I believe it's to the connections inspector, maybe not, maybe it's the, I'll find it eventually. I think it is in the attributes inspector. There's something over here, and I don't remember which one it is. I have to drag around and look for it. But there now is a checkbox that basically says, use this as my start form, so to speak. By default, it's this one. But you can go over and change it, and if you do, it takes that arrow and it moves it over to here. And there's a reason I'm telling you this. The reason I'm telling you this is prior to about Xcode 6, what you had to do was over here, when you brought up your different, your different controls, there was a thing over here that was called storyboard pointer. And if you went and grabbed one of those and you drag that over to here, then it automatically took that arrow and it put it over so it's coming onto here. And the reason that I'm telling you that, and Teresa's going through this, she's got a newer version of Xcode than we're running in here. Because when she got her machine, she went out to the App Store and got the latest and greatest version. Well, as the language becomes more and more mature, things that worked in one version will still work in another version, but sometimes you've got to make changes in order to get them to work. All right? I mean, you call it the problems with progress, whatever you want. All right? All right, and the last one, this is almost going to look like, I believe at least, when you see this, you might say, we're doing a step back here. We already know how to do this stuff, etc., etc. And some of it, yes, you do. But I want to make sure you see this. All right? The idea is, I've got a text box or a text field right here. A button here and a label down here. I don't know if you remember this or not. And the reason I made that blue was so it stood up, okay? But if I go and click in here, what do I get right here? Rhymes with keyboard, all right? You get the keyboard. But you have to put some text in so that keyboard disappears after you click the button when you touch off of it, right? And the reason I wanted to show you that was here's the code. First thing is, I put in here UI text field delegate because we're going to do some stuff with the text field. All right? But the key thing is what's in here and what's in here. All right? And I don't know how blue those look, but it's the stuff in here. Remember this thing, resign first responder? What you're saying is you're giving up control. And you may or may not have noticed it, but if you put your mouse over, I think it's this one, that's his first responder. All right, the one that's up there. All right. So the idea is when I run this program,
And I come in here and I click inside of here. Come on, give me that. There we go. And we put in our old hello world. The idea is supposedly it's transferred that stuff to the label that you see down there. But you can't see the label because the keyboard is there. But notice if I click off, it's not there until I click the show button. And there it is. All right, the show button actually had the code in there to copy it from one to the other. All right. But the point is, the way that that is set up right now is I can now click on any blank space that's in here, and I can make the keyboard go away. All right? And the reason that I took a second or two to show you that is I want to show you the last project now, and this is the one I'd like us to build as a class. Again, you've got the code in front of you, all right? And it is. It's maybe the world's simplest to-do list, all right? But there's a couple things built into it too that, for lack of better words, are kind of neat. All right, so I'm going to come in here, and notice when I come in here and I bring it up, it should say, like, I think it's going to say on here, it's going to have a task. It'll say SSS, and it's just some garbage I put in there before I got out last time. All right? All right, so that's the garbage that was there. But what I also want is I want to be able to hold down here on the touchpad, swipe to the left, and then tell it, boom, it comes up, and now it's gone. All right, so if I go over to here, I can add an item now. I should have probably changed the color in here again, so I can say, so it's a to-do list, so let's say get milk. All right, and I can add an item. Now notice, you hopefully you notice, as soon as I put that in, it immediately blanked it out, for lack of better words, because I might have a bunch of stuff I want to add. All right, so I want to do that. Take a nap. All right, so I want to do that also. I can click over here and that goes away. I can tell it to go back. There's my to-do list. All right, so I've created it and I put it in there. And if I decide, oh, I already got milk, again, I can hold down, swipe to the left, and delete that, and the other one moves up. Does that all make sense? So that's what I'd like us to take a little bit of time to build right now. You've got the code. That's the handout that I gave you. So the code is in front of you. So I'd like to take just a minute to go through the code first. All right? I've done this 3 or 4 times, and it's worked every time. There hasn't been a problem with it. But like I said, I want to take a couple minutes to go over the code. And the code, as you could probably imagine, is going to be in 2 different files. First view controller.swift and second view controller, .swift. All right? So I want to take, like I said, just a couple minutes. If you haven't figured this out already, and I believe you all have, the hardest part of this language is, well, there's something already built out there for me to do what I want to do, but it's finding it. All right? Because it's quirky compared to a lot of the other languages you've worked with. So the language is a bit quirky, and you're using a different kind of computer that you're not using. Maybe some of you are, but most of the people in here are not used to using. You've been weaned in a Windows environment, and you're asked to be doing something that's not Windows. Okay? And I think I brought this up to you the other day, but not all of you may have been here. I don't know. But last year, when it came out in 2014, mid-2014, right when it came out, Swift was known as the 68th best language, all right, to learn. It's already up to 22, and from what I've read, they're thinking it's going to be in the top 10 by next year. So it ain't going away. Say what you want to say about Macs, iPhones, or anything else. But what I've decided, Doug Tabbitt once said, and I agree with him, he said there are no Mac fans.
He said there's only Mac fanatics. You know, and fan is short for fanatic. All right? But that might be being a little bit too critical of them, but I'd say they're unbelievably loyal people. All right? My kids don't care about the fact that they still got the iPhone 5 and it's a smaller one. You know, I show them the size of mine and it's got a lot bigger face on it. They don't care. They love their iPhones. All right? They talked about it, you know, when our contract comes up, oh, Dad, yeah, if you get us a bigger one, that's fine. But I'm fine with it the way it is. All right? And all I'm saying is this stuff isn't going away. So let's take a quick look at what's in here. First thing, you may or may not have realized this. This variable right here, var toDoList equals string paren. Couple things about it. First of all, by putting it in here, that's saying it's an array. All right? But in order to actually instantiate the array, you need the paren. Okay? That's just the way that arrays are set up in this language. So this is saying create a blank string array and call it toDoList. That's the first thing. Second thing, do you notice it's outside of the class? Why did I do that?
Sculpt, you can use it.
So I can use it where?
Anywhere.
I can use it anywhere, not only in first view controller.swift, but also in second view controller.swift. It's one thing to go and pass a variable around inside of the same class you're in. It's another thing to have that variable accessible from class to class. And by setting it up like this, that's what we're able to do. All right? So that's the first thing. Then, I'm just going to move down on here. Okay? You'll notice, or hopefully you notice, class first view controller, you know, and it inherits from view controller, but it also has this in here. And if I hold down on a command and I click here again, come on, give me that. So if I hold down on command and then click, that shows me everything that's available in UI table delegate. And there's two big things in here that we need. One is number of rows and sections. And that's how many rows basically we're going to be working with. And quite often, not always, but quite often when you're working with that, it'll be the name of your array or whatever it is you're using, .count. That just says, so if I have a to-do list that has 800 items in it, count will be 800. We're not talking about how many you're going to show on a screen. We're talking about how many are in there. Does that make sense? All right. And then the other one basically is that you're going to be using is this cell function that we looked a little bit at last week, but it's how do you want this to show? There is a whole chapter in the book. It's either 9, 10, or 11. I don't remember which one. Chapter 12 in our book is on NSUserDefaults. So if you don't like what I gave you on that, it's in there. All right? I'm just giving you some of the highlights, so to speak. But when we go in here and we set up the cell, and you're going to see it in just a minute, I just use the default. All right? Because I don't have the time or the desire to sit there and pretty it up. So if you don't like the default, which basically is about as blah as you get, there are a bunch of other different settings that you can use in there. And again, our book, our PDF, whatever you want to call it, it goes through those. But in order to be able to use these two things, I have to set up that delegate. All right, and that was just me putting in a comma, typing in UI table view delegate. Okay. Now, am I right in assuming right at the top of your screen there in line 18, you all understand this? I just grabbed the table view and dragged it in. Does that make sense? All right, and here I set up an outlet to it. Okay, that's it. Okay. This is what I just mentioned before, number of rows in section. It returns an integer, all right? And that's toDoList.count. So what that is every single time I go and add an item to that array, this gets bumped up by 1. Every time I just do that swipe where I showed you where I delete it, it gets decremented by 1. Does all that make sense? Now it becomes kind of an important point because when you first run the program, if it's the first time you ever run the program, how many things are in there? None. So sometimes, depending on what you're working with, you might have to check to make sure, you know, depending on what you're trying to do, and you'll see that in just a minute, okay? This is setting up the cell, what I mentioned to you before. So I'm just calling it cell. It's a UI table view cell. I just give me the default style, and I'm going to refer to it in my program as cell. Do you remember?
Come on, there we go. Remember when we looked at this a week or so ago, and I came over to here, move that over a bit. All right, and we went to the prototype cell, and notice that's set to 1. By default, if you weren't here last week, this is set to 0 by default. As soon as you change that from 0 to 1, it adds this for you. And that just says that's a prototype of what a cell will look like. It doesn't say the word prototype or the word cell. It just is showing us that. Then if we click here, it changes that identifier that you see right there, that one. That's the same thing that I used in that reuse identifier. And it should be the same caseness, it should be the same everything. Okay? It's an identifier. So that's it right there on line 33 where it says cell.
Then this right here, I try to put the comment there. Fill the table cell with the current to-do list value. So remember, when I showed you that thing where I put in there get milk or whatever it was, all right, we put it into a text field. We hit the button. When we hit the button, we were saying, okay, now what we've done is we've just thrown it into an array. What this is telling us is now as we go through the array, grab the current value and copy that into my current cell. Notice right here, there's no loop, but it's going to fill the table up for you in one swoop, regardless of whether you have 0 things, 1 things, or 100 things. Doesn't matter. Then you return it. Now we need this return cell because this says we're going to return a UI table view cell. And that's why cell is of type UI table view cell. It has to be that way. All right?
Again, I went a little nutso maybe with the comments, but I thought I'd rather give you too much and have you look at it and be able to write it yourself and remove this stuff. What this is doing is this code that you see right in here, this stuff, right there, lines 51 through 68, so about 15 lines approximately. Those handle that swipe, okay? When you swipe, think about it this way. You're doing an edit, whether you realize it or not. You're doing an edit, but you're removing what's currently highlighted, but you are doing an edit. So the way that this works with tables, if you're either doing a straight edit, so if I want to change something, maybe I spelled milk wrong. Okay, so I typed in get mick, and I want to go back and change it to milk. Okay, type of thing. In either case, what I'm doing right there is I'm going to make a change to the actual values that are going in the array, so I have to commit those. And that's what this is doing right here. And this one says, hey, if what I'm about to commit, if I'm doing a delete, and that actually recognizes the swipe to the left. That's what that is. All right, so it says if I'm doing that, I want to remove from my to-do list, which was set at the top, that was the array, I want to remove that current entry in there. All right, I also want to update, so what this is doing right here is that's writing it back to NSUserDefaults. So it says, okay, what I want to do is I want to make sure always what's in the array is synced up with what's in the table, and which is synced up with what's in NSUserDefaults. So that's what we're doing right here. All right. And so after we do all that, we have to update the table. And when you do a reload data, you may remember that from last week. If you weren't here, we did a couple simple examples, including a times table or a multiplication table.
and we use the slider with it. And as you move the slider back and forth, all right, you have to always be calling reload data. That's the rest of it right here. So first, this isn't something I wrote. Anytime you see override with something, you're overriding something that the system has. So this says literally when your view does appear, all right, so again, whenever you switch back from the second view controller to the first view controller, update the table because it may have changed. Chances are pretty good it did change, right? Because probably you went to the second table because you wanted to add an item. So when you switch back to the first table, you want to make sure that item is there. So the idea is you're building this list with just a bunch of strings. You're sticking them in a table. It's supposed to reflect you having some kind of a to-do list. As you get things done in your to-do list, you remove them by doing a swipe to the left and clicking the delete button. And literally, you can go out there, because I've done it. You can go out and Google to-do lists, and I'm sure there are ones that are better than this. This was about the smallest one that I could think of. So I grabbed the one that was out there. In fact, I didn't even grab one that was out there. I kind of started with my own, then looked at a bunch of them that were out there and kind of melded them into one type of an idea. All right. Then in the Viewdidload, synchronize the to-do list with the user defaults for permanent storage capability. If we're running this for the first time, the to-do list will not exist yet. We would get an error if we don't put this in. So if you tried to just do this, you'd be trying to write nil out to your table, and the system would be confused. So you check and you say, hey, as long as it's not nil, then write it out to NSUserDefaults. Notice there's no else in there, because if it's not there, it's the first time, there's nothing to write out yet. So don't do anything. And that's everything. I'm going to go through the other one in a second. Does that make sense? All right.
Again, if it doesn't, I'd say take some time and actually take a look at a couple of the chapters that are in the book.
All right. So this is the second view controller. This view controller literally, so the first one looks like this. So here's the first view controller. I put a nav bar on there just so I could have a nice little title that said to-do list. All right, so that's a nav bar. And then the whole rest of this in here, that's all the UI table view. So that's the first view controller. As far as the second view controller goes, okay, there's a label here that says something like add item to add, or maybe it's add to-do list item or something like that. Add to-do list item. All right. So again, that's a label. This is a text field where you actually type that in, and that's the button that says add item. All right. So again, the idea is you type something in there, get milk. You click the button. Two things have got to happen here. First of all, the first thing that has to happen is that get milk has got to be written out to that array that's called to-do list. All right. And after it writes it, it's got to remove this because it thinks I might want to add something else. Then at the bottom here, I've got a button. There's a button right here that says something along the lines of second. And every time I click it, I go right here. Right? And there's the equivalent of a button over here that says first. And every time I click it, I go over here. And that's the segue that was set up to allow you to go back and forth between the two. Okay?
So if we look here, this add item
Right there. So the code that's here from lines 16 through 27, that's what I want to have happen whenever I do press that button. All right? So I want to append it to my array.
what? Item, that's what I call this, the text. Then I want to take the text that's in there and get rid of it. Then I want to take what I've just grabbed and I want to write that in out to NSUserDefaults so I can keep that in sync. Okay. The touches began. Right here, I already talked about that with you. And again, that's set up so that I can click off of it anywhere to make the keyboard go away. Same thing with the respond. Okay. So they work in kind of in concert with one another. And the rest of the stuff that's in there is just all the, quote, normal stuff, unquote. All right? So, take a break in a minute, but what I'd like to do is have you start up, get into Xcode if you're not into Xcode. And we'll start up a new project. What you name it really isn't that important. All right, but there's one thing I just want us to do, and then we could take a break. So I'm going to start in here, and you notice I've got toDoList here, and I've got a bunch of other ones, but this is the one that works. I know there's not a problem with it because I just called it to-do. So this one that's right here, I'm just going to take it and drag it into the garbage. So hopefully no sleight of hand. You can all see there that up on my screen, I don't have on the actual desktop. There's no toDoList project. So that's where I'm going to create one right now. So I want to be in Xcode, and I want to do a File, New, Project, and I want to call it, this time we're going to do it different. So if you've already started, hold it. We're going to choose Tabbed Application. We're going to choose that one. First time ever. What that's going to do is that's going to create an interface for us that looks like this. And imagine each one of these things that are up on these rectangles I'm drawing are view controllers. That one is going to automatically say first, that one will say second. That's kind of your root view controller. The first that you have right there is this one. The second that you have right there is this one. Okay? So notice if I come in here and I choose Tabbed Application and I click Next, and before I do you also notice in the second row what's there all by itself? See where it says Games? We're going to use that in 2 to 3 weeks when we do the sprite stuff. All right? So with Tabbed Application chosen, I'm going to click Next. All right. iPhone is just fine. I'll call this toDoList. I'm going to put my initials on there just in case I already have one by that name, even though I know I don't. But that's fine, just to be safe. And I'm going to save that. When it comes up for next, I'm going to save it. I'm going to make sure it's right on the desktop itself, proper. So I'm going to click Desktop there, and I'm going to click Create. All right, and now notice, again, if you look up on the screen here, I'll take a break in just a couple minutes, but if you look on the screen, there's my first view controller, there's my second view controller. All right, here's my storyboard, and notice when I bring up the storyboard. Looks a little bit klutzy, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to shut some stuff to try to give myself some more room. Well, that's pretty big. This second and this first one, these are pretty big, but remember I showed you this before. I can click here, and I can go over to my object library, and under Inferred, I can change the size to 4-inch. I'm going to do that there, and that's going to fix a bunch of it. All right, it's already looking a little nicer, but that second one is still pretty big, so I want to change that one also, and I'm going to make that 4-inch. All right, so that's looking a little better, but then I want to change this main one over here too that says Tab Bar Controller, and I want to change that to 4-inch. All right, and you may or may not have ever noticed this. If you double click, it gets real small, and if you double click again, it gets real large. And the only reason I'm showing you that is it's kind of hard to see on here because all of them are in white. But there's my tab view controller right here, and there's Segways going to the first view, and there's another one going to the second view.
So I get all that stuff by default. If I wanted to, I could have built this as a single view application. All right, I could have built it as just a single view application, then dragged out 2 view controllers. That would have been fine also. All right. Anytime you use one of the quote shortcuts here, you can do it without using a shortcut. All right. So it is 4. Let's take a break and let's come back at 4:15, please.